Hello, everybody. My name is Maggie Vandenberg with the IQ Business Group. I'm happy to be your moderator for today's webinar, When and How to Preserve Your Information, Strategies for Success. I'm joined today by Ryan Britton, Vice President of Delivery from Mint. I'm also joined by Paul Stark, VP of Sales, Gareth Aitken, VP of Commercial Strategy, Sean McCauley, U.S. Marketing Manager, and Lori Ashley, all from Preservica. We are proud to sponsor today's webinar to support our public and private sector folks, including Fed, SLED, and our private sector friends looking to integrate preservation into their information governance strategy.
Thank you, Maggie. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for attending. Preservica is one of the major players in the provision of digital preservation worldwide. We count among our customers some 20 or more national libraries, national archives around the world in some 20 countries. We're trusted by over half the US states for their records and archives in the US. But beyond that, other than being a vendor, we're sort of culturally focused on our customers and those groups that support them. So we provide material support to Nagara, ARMA, PRIA, COSA. These are organizations that support records keepers and archives across the country, and we provide them with financial support, educational support going forward. And that support has resulted in a vibrant community of digital preservation practitioners from around the world. We have the largest user group in the industry. And one thing I noted when I came to Preservica, which I've never seen in a technology company before, I saw our customers hugging our employees, which, although disconcerting, I consider to be a very positive sign. Next slide, please. Over to you, Ryan.
Hey everyone, my name is Ryan Britton, and I work for a company called Mint. It's a group of companies focused on the Microsoft technology stack with a 20-year history of success implementing those technologies. We're active in 5 territories. We have a portfolio of 15 or so gold competencies. We're a member of the coveted Inner Circle membership inside of Microsoft, and essentially Microsoft is what we do day in and day out. I'm very excited about this webinar. We've been implementing information governance and compliance strategies on the Microsoft 365 platform for a number of years now. And digital preservation is a topic that seems to come up more and more often, but has until up to this point been quite a dark art in terms of getting folks to nail down exactly what the benefit is and how it all works, especially in the Microsoft space. So I'm really excited to see what our experts on the call today can tell us about the topic.
And IQBG is a leading provider of records and information management solutions for the public sector and highly regulated industries. Since 2008, the IQ Business Group has been developing ECRM and content services solutions for highly regulated industries, including public and private sectors, that leverage people, process, and technologies to support your requirements. And now with everybody introduced, let's go ahead and get into it.
Great, thank you, Maggie. So Ryan referred to preservation or digital preservation as a bit of a dark art. And as with the advent of most new technologies, the people who invented it find themselves standing in the dark, trying to talk to people about it and why it's valuable. Well, here it is in a nutshell. The information that defines us culturally and historically is at risk. This digital information is frail, it's fragile. Our mission is to protect it, and that means be able to keep it forever, make it usable. So file formats that are out of date or obsolete, we make them available to you without further ado. We make it searchable, findable, and useful going forward. Next slide. So the good news is we're no longer standing in the dark storm by ourselves. One of the major technology analyst firms in the world, Gartner, has recognized the need for digital preservation. They recognize that hardware marches forward in never-ending parade. Software is constantly updated. File formats become obsolete, and they want to keep information available to organizations forever for a number of reasons. So next slide, please. So first and foremost, many organizations, especially government organizations, the point of recordation, are legally required by their legislatures to make information available in perpetuity. So information that is deemed permanent, that could be records, could be archival information, is required by the records officer or the archivist to be made available forever in original format. So Jelaine Chubb, who is the archivist for the state of Texas, responded to this some years ago and became a Preservica customer by complying with legal mandates from the Texas legislature. It was prompted by the governor leaving office and electronic communications being public records that need to be kept forever. And Rick Perry's information was on email servers, it was on file servers in the governor's office, it was all over the place. So Jelaine took the mandate to make that information available, to preserve it. She digitized information that was not digital and included video and imaging files, emails, attachment to emails, and makes that available through the Texas State Library Archives. So next file.
You know what I find interesting here? The Texas Archives example is something that I would expect, but I had a discussion with a friend of mine who runs a small but successful engineering firm, and the topic of preservation is something that you would not expect to apply to a small private sector organization. But he recently had an issue where their CAD drawings that they've been storing for the 20 plus years that they've been in business, a good portion of them are no longer usable simply because they can't retrieve them. The CAD tool that they use to produce them is no longer maintained by the organization. And so anecdotally, it's amazing to me how pervasive the concerns of digital preservation are becoming.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. We hear that a lot. We have a lot of customers. So interesting piece of information. Our customers preserve in excess of 1,000 different file formats. So if you think about that, most people don't even know there are 1,000 file formats, and CAD is a perfect example. So many of those are vendor specific, and they're required to keep that information. So in the example of your engineering firm, that information is vital. They may be required at some point in the future to go back to something they designed, a bridge, a road, a tunnel, and retrieve those documents and see what the specifications were and make sure they were in line with the original specifications. So as in the example of Jelaine Chubb in Texas, much of this is to mitigate legal risk, right? You're legally required to keep these. In the case of an engineering firm, it's in their best interest to keep them. It's their intellectual property. It's the work they do. In the case of a corporation, legal documents are often kept to mitigate risk. Let's face it, we live in a very litigious society. If you are required to produce information, whether it's a 20-year-old counterparty contract or a customer onboarding form to produce to show that you are in fact doing what you said you were going to do, if you can't do that, that's a risk to your organization. Really, the last reason that people keep information really in perpetuity is the value of information. Information is valuable. Most organizations, that is their intellectual property, right? It may be software, it may be hardware, it might be whatever, but it's the information. So if you're a marketer in a large corporation and you find an image on a file drive that you want to use for a nostalgia marketing campaign, how do you do that? Who owns it? Who put it there? Do you have a license to use it? All of that information would be available in a properly executed digital preservation process. So those are just some examples of why people are looking at digital preservation and why Ryan, your friend, is a good example. Didn't occur to them before, and all of a sudden it's like, well, now what do we do? So next slide, please. So these are some of the nuts and bolts reasons why people are grappling with how to preserve information on an ongoing basis. I'm sure we all remember, those of us who are old enough anyway, floppy disks, and after that, optical disks, right, which had the promise of keeping our information forever. We found out after 10 years or so, they're not readable. So my music collection from the 1970s is gone, unfortunately. That's just an example. Legacy system. So this is what my grandmother used to call a twofer. So if you are required to keep the information in a system That doesn't mean you're required to keep the software in that system. It means you're required to keep the information. So digital preservation enables you to get that information, and we'll see a good case study on that in the future. But it also enables you to retire the legacy system itself. So you can retire the software, you can retire the support license, you can make the hardware go away, you can reduce complexity in your IT environment. That will make all your IT folks very happy, and it will also make your compliance officers happy because you've captured the information and you're digitally preserving it. Going back to that image reference earlier, if you don't have a digital preservation system, it's often difficult to determine where the content came from. Within what context did you come to have it? What is the metadata that describes it? Who wrote it? When? Why? Unclear ownership. Do I have a license to use this? Where did this quote come from? Has it been changed? Can I establish provenance? Is it a quote? Is it from our chief executive, 50 years ago? Corrupted or deleted files. We see this a lot. We have a very large client who lost some very valuable data when their IT folks upgraded the operating system on a series of servers. Given what's been going on for the last 2 years with the pandemic, this particular information happened to be all the data files for how this particular organization deployed resources to respond to the Spanish flu. You might imagine that could have been useful. Obsolete file formats. The most famous one is I've got a contract from 20 years ago and it's in WordPerfect. What do I do? Well, if you digitally preserved it, you don't have to do anything. You just open it and look at it. So another perfect example of sort of the nuts and bolts that records managers and archivists deal with on a day-to-day basis that is addressed by digital preservation. No software license or vendor support. Vendors go away all the time. They upgrade systems. Old versions are not supported. Once again, you're protected by digital preservation. And lossy conversions. Someone took a Microsoft Word or a WordPerfect document, and they created a Word document from it. Is everything in there? You don't know. So establishing the authenticity of a document at that point is very difficult. Next slide, please.
And I would say that
I was going to say, and actually, a really interesting point on that last one there about lossy conversions, because some of the steps that we see organizations regularly take to preserve information can be PDFing it. But if there's valuable information in the original, that can be lost. So, I mean, one of the examples that come to mind, I know of from the pharma industry, and if you think about their requirements to not only preserve the results of maybe clinical trials and conclusions that have come to, but also the decisions and the calculations that allowed you to get to those conclusions. And just in a simple form, if you think about something like a spreadsheet that has calculations and formula in it, and if you were to PDF a spreadsheet, then potentially you lose access to all of those important calculations. So you lose the dynamic data that helps you get to the answers there. You're left with a static representation. Whereas if you can preserve and maintain that dynamic information, it means that the value of the information persists, as well as the potential just the initial flat information that goes with it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's a great point, Gareth. So PDF is an image, right? And as soon as you go to an image, you invoke OCR, which, while it's fine, automatically means you lose associated metadata. So digital preservation, right? So if you're a records manager, if you're an archivist, you've been trained in the science of documents, content, records, keeping them, right? And historically, what folks have done is they have microfilm things, right? So Portia Sanders, who manages day-to-day operations in the largest county in the country, in the clerk recorder's office, about 9 years ago, realized that microfilm was a dying medium. It was manual, it was cumbersome. It did not address her need to append documents, right? So recorder's office records deeds, real property documents, vital documents, goes on and on. Anything that defines your legal or financial relationship with another individual, another organization, or the government. Those documents change over time. So she was looking for a way to preserve documents in perpetuity that were required by law to be preserved, And microfilm wasn't doing it for her anymore. It was just too manual, too problematic. So she looked into digital preservation, and we as a company are very proud to say that a little over a year ago, Los Angeles County became a Preservica customer. So they are in production. They're putting tens of millions of documents into Preservica. They started with real property records. They're now ingesting and preserving vital records. And these records are subject to even vital records, which are deemed permanent on the first day of birth. A birth record's a perfect example. On your day of birth, you're assigned a sex. Well, that can change going forward based on personal decisions. So how do you deal with that in microfilm? How do you deal with that in physical records? How do you create an appended record? What do you do with the original record? All of those eventualities are addressed with digital preservation and its capabilities. So perfect example of a very large, sophisticated organization who has a ton of technology and woke up one day and said, we're doing things the old way. Let's digitize. That's part of our mantra. We want digital government. We want transparency. We want responsiveness. We want to be more responsive to our residents than we have been in the past. The only way to do that is to cut down on the manual processes. And one of them was microfilm. So perfect example of how you apply digital preservation, replacing something that you're doing today. So it's not an add-on in terms of budget, and it actually is an efficiency in terms of process. Next slide, please.
Something that strikes me as you're talking through the bullet points on the previous slide and that use case is that the risk is actually growing as we progress year to year. The time it takes for recording mediums to advance, the time it takes for new versions of software to come out. And I can remember 2003 was a format for Word documents until 2007, then 2012. Nowadays, there's an update coming out every second week.
Right.
And likewise, if you look at the longevity of stiffy disks versus optical disks versus DVDs, it's just progressing at a pace where I can imagine that risk grows every year.
Absolutely true. Anyone who manages a content platform will tell you, Ryan, the amount of information and diversity of information, so velocity, variety, volume, all those things are going through the roof, and they're increasing at a rate exponentially. So there's probably a bunch of people in the audience who are saying, okay, I'm not Los Angeles County. I don't have an IT budget in the tens of millions of dollars. I don't have 100,000 employees, but I have this problem. What do I do? This document is the entire roadmap to putting digital preservation in place in your organization, right? So when content records are created, captured, recorded, they're either born permanent or they have a retention schedule assigned to them. They're used by the organization going forward. If they are deemed to be long-term, they go to digital preservation along with born permanent documents. If they have short-term retention, then the retention schedule says, here's what your defensible destruction date is, right? And at disposition time, because of the audit trail that is native to a digital preservation system, you know exactly what has been done to the document. You have an audit trail, and you can establish its authenticity at any point in its lifestyle. So next.
That's it. Yeah, actually, just on this one, as you said there, Paul. So this is the important point where we take the discussion around the isolation of digital preservation when it comes to a particular record and consider it in the context of the context of the record's life cycle. Now this if you think about it, if you look at as you said, the traditional steps through capture through to disposition, that all looks fairly standard, but there are some important additions on here that take what we would recommend and advise in terms of solving a lot of the problems that you've just been discussing there, which is about considering preservation. Ideally, you should start to consider that at the point of where that record is created, especially if it's born permanent in particular. Now, there's lots of potential steps if you think about managing permanent records. Importantly, the key aspects around your policies, your systems, access and disposition, and so on. A lot of that's supported by IT systems today. But this is where preservation fits in. And the best way to address a lot of these requirements is to have a plan for the life of the record, which begins at capture. And I think that's an important point to show, which is different here. So if it is a born permanent record, as you described earlier, can it be preserved now? That makes a more sensible decision. It means it's taken care of from that point onwards. Traditionally, you might have waited to the point of disposition, but if there has been or there is a long retention applied to that, then potentially all of those risks that Paul was describing earlier could be faced by that record. It might be the point when you come to use it, you can no longer access it. So it's not just about maybe the archive, it's about if you're thinking about how within state agencies, long-term records may be managed by a record center. And this is the point where your digital preservation repository can start to take care and apply those preservation actions that make sure that the information continues to be readable and accessible and usable for the long term. And that goes all the way through finding the right point. Once its collaboration and use is complete, can it be preserved then? The other interesting thing is, which we're going to talk about a bit more in a moment, is it starts to bring in the concept of transfers to support preservation. So any solutions that you're thinking about here needs to consider the life and the use of the record holistically. And as you said there, I think Ryan and Paul, of course, all these problems are getting bigger. So it has to start managing this more at scale, which might sound like it's becoming a bit tricky. There's more for everyone to do. But what we're going to start talking about now is that if you have the right tools and you can look to address these challenges by bringing in integrations, automation, and making things simple, then you can get the benefits that Paul's been talking about, but potentially you can make it easier for everyone as well.
If I'm understanding you correctly, I mean, we're seeing a lot of what you're saying in our consulting, which is perhaps less preservation focused and more in the realm of dealing with collaboration platforms and existing records platforms, which probably don't provide the insurance we're talking about in terms of storage media and file formats, etc. And what we're finding is that those two worlds are colliding, and that organizations are looking to manage the life cycle of a particular document from creation through its collaboration process, how it gets distributed, where it gets stored, archived, and then finally into that record keeping phase of its life. What I'm hearing here is that it's almost like preservation is an additional element that works in lockstep with your collaboration platform and existing shorter term record systems that don't perhaps have that level of insurance. It sounds like there could be a really good life cycle that extends into all three of those platforms quite comfortably.
Absolutely, and in simple terms, in the past, I've used the term apply your preservation policy alongside your records policy as well. So, but then let's look at that in a bit more detail if we go to the next slide. Thank you. So, I mean, so as you said there are a lot of changes that we are seeing, that I think that everyone is seeing, and probably most people in the audience here. So, these are some of the more macro trends that we're looking at, which we think are relevant. So, if you think about the first one there, accelerated digital transformation, I think we've all experienced that to some extent. I think we all know the reasons why over the last couple of years, but there was some reports I remember reading last year that talked about how the acceleration of organizations' transformation has been up to 7 times greater than what it would have been had we not had the shift to remote working driven by COVID as well. So businesses, to make sure that their businesses can continue to operate, have gone through many stages. That's part of it. And some really interesting data, in particular around Microsoft. I know there's been lots of Zoom numbers around, but Microsoft in particular, then I think their own numbers stated that in April 2020, there were 75 million monthly active users for Teams. A year later, in April 21, that was 145 million. And in January this year, that was up to 270 million. So that's a huge growth overall in terms of just Teams usage. And we know that Teams isn't just about talking and video calls and so on. And with that, you've got nearly 1.5 billion monthly active users of Windows as well. So there's a lot of people working within the Microsoft environment. On top of that, there's a move away from legacy platforms to support this digital transformation, especially into cloud solutions. Recently, we did a poll at a Nagara event, and I think it was nearly 80% of organizations the majority of the organizations across the board had long-term and permanent records held in network drives, file shares, other EDRMs that are on-premise, a really diverse range of locations for storing records, which were often being held on-premise, presenting challenges, of course, here that are now starting to be addressed. And many of those are looking to migrate now into a cloud-based environment, and often into a 365 environment. I think there was another statistic that came out of Gartner, which said that 9 out of 10 organizations were using 365 in some format, and of the remainder, 60% of them were expecting to transition within the next 6 to 12 months. So it's becoming ubiquitous. I mean, with that as well, in terms of the volume of just records that are being created, some statistics that I read that there was from the IDC, that there was a compound annual growth between 2020 and 2025 of 23%. Now, obviously, a lot of that is maybe transient data, short-term throwaway, maybe edge devices and so on. But if everything's growing, then there's a lot of important, valuable information in there which also needs to be managed. And again, at the Nagara event, when asked, I think that was when nearly 80% of those organizations said they'd seen significant growth in their electronic records. So this is a common problem affecting everyone, and it's a big problem that goes with it. And importantly, the complexity of some of that information. So I mentioned Teams at the start there. Teams is interesting because it starts to introduce new types of information. We've often traditionally thought about flat documents, single documents. But if you think about what goes on now, you've got Teams chats, you've got recordings, you've got maybe attachments in there as well, and that's what we would call multi-part assets. But it means there's multiple dimensions to what potentially are important records, maybe places where decisions are being made that you have to capture and manage for the long term. So there's lots of people ultimately creating lots of content, and a lot of that happens to be within the Microsoft environment, and that's what needs to be kept and be preserved as well. In the middle there, we're talking about records and archive synergies, and that's an interesting one, which does relate a bit to the previous slide. So if you're looking at, there was a COSA report, I think it was last year, which shows that within the US, 42 of the 56 states and territories have joint archives and records management programs. So, and also hearing separately through other information governance officers that that's increasingly common, which is great because it does mean that people are looking collectively together, but it does sometimes present conflicting priorities. And as we saw in the previous slide, one of those challenges might be around transfers, and that's maybe a common one. Again, looking at some of the data coming out of COSA in their Move It report a couple of years ago now, I think it said a number of the agencies reported they didn't know how to identify permanent public records, but 42% were unaware of how to transfer them to permanent repositories. So there's a lot of challenges. Transfer in itself can be really important just to make sure the information is protected and preserved where you need to do so. Also means that so that you can find and access it afterwards. But to do that effectively, you obviously need teams to work collectively together, good relationships. So if the records and archives functions are coming together, that's a plus. But you need to talk to the same language, you need to understand each other's context, you need to have the right workflows and the right tools. So the infrastructure needs to come together, the processes, the ability to classify and avoid complexity and support the environments where people are. So we just talked about how many people are working within Microsoft and 365. So there are lots of these challenges and variables which have to be addressed to manage these problems, which are growing at scale. And that last one on the end there is what Paul's spoken a lot about, the traditional risk. But I think it's there just to remind everyone that with all of these things we've talked about, it might sound that what was a challenging problem is getting harder, but I think what we're here today to say is that actually if you find the right way of tools and building the relationships within your organization, setting up the right processes, then actually you can simplify a lot of this and you can manage those challenges at scale.
Yeah, so that's a good point, Gareth. That brings up something else that Portia Sanders from Los Angeles County discussed with us when she was really building her trusted digital repository. She was convinced her record system was a single point of failure. And in fact, if there were ever an intrusion into the IT environment in Los Angeles County, whether it was ransomware or denial of service, she wanted to be able to maintain business continuity and wanted to have access to records that were elsewhere, separate and apart from her corporate IT environment. And we have another client, top 100 county also in the country, who specified that we deployed Preservica to the east of the San Andreas fault line because they were subject to plate tectonic activity. And one of their risks identified was losing records and a data center that was near the fault line. So it's sort of an unintended benefit, if you will, aside from making your organization more efficient and more accountable for your job, doing your job, keeping records available forever. You're also bringing a benefit to the organization that was maybe not part of your original remit, but will definitely make people in your organization happy and reduce your risk.
Absolutely. Okay, next slide then, please. So I said on the previous one there that's actually looking at Microsoft, and so there is a bit of a focus here now because we think that is a place to look at. In particular, I mean, Microsoft is doing a lot of work. I think we've all seen that. If people are working with 365 different agencies or your organization, you'll see that there's been a lot that's added in recent years to support better retention schedules and records management programs with their information governance and compliance center additions over time. And that's great, particularly when it comes to the short to medium term. But of course, there is a lot of valuable content out there which goes beyond that in terms of the long term and permanent, as we've been discussing. And that's where we think there's a gap. So it's important for us to look at this, but I think it's important for every organization to consider it that's using 365. Especially when you think about the information, maybe it's no longer active, but if it does have a long-term retention, or maybe it's been classified as permanent to begin with, it still needs some level of management, and that's required for ensuring your compliance, your security, the protection of that information, all for the lifetime of that information. And that would be through the retention, and as you were saying there earlier, Ryan, the retention alongside the preservation. So that's sort of the retention and preservation policies that can go hand in hand together. With that as well, it sometimes just makes good sense because you can provide a cleaner, uncluttered working environment for your active information, making sure that only the information that's required by your information workers is available, it's there in the right place, it can be found and used as required. And importantly, is that sometimes it makes it simple and fast and lower cost to store the right information, the growing volumes that we've talked about, in the right places and finding it where it's needed. Sometimes SharePoint isn't the right place for that. If it is inactive, if it is a long-term retention schedule on there or permanent, that might not be the right place to keep it. So tackling these challenges of scale, but actually now it's time to start thinking about, well, how do we manage this? We talked about some of these complexities. Are there opportunities for automation? And I think the answer there is clearly yes, there are ways to do it, because if you are setting up these programs in 365, you're likely to be investing in it. You're likely to be putting in place your own programs. And if you think about what 365 allows you to do now, as well as your perhaps default retention policies in place, you can define quite potentially simple or complex records programs, defining labels for either non-records retention or records retention or sensitivity. And the great news is that those are available across all of the 365 substrate applications. If you think about SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange, and Teams as well. So it's much simpler to manage all of that information across all of those different applications where it's being created, if you can find a way to hook into the programs that you're already putting in place. And I think that's where the opportunity is to take that forward.
Yeah, I can do no more than echo what you're saying. In our consulting, we've seen and we believe that M365 is a fantastic platform when it comes to productivity. Teams has become a first-class citizen in terms of collaboration, where chat-based apps were historically shadow IT. It's highly available, it's disaster resilient, it's all of the things that you could wish for, but there are caveats in there as well in terms of the way that you use that M365 platform. As you said, SharePoint storage is highly available and performant, but it's not necessarily a good choice for records that are needed for long-term storage. Microsoft will sell you the storage quite happily for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, but you'd be better served storing that at low cost in an alternate solution that is fit for purpose and built around the kind of retention that you require for those types of long-term records. The other thing is that as much as productivity is fantastic with applications like Teams, it's actually making the data environment from a records manager and compliance officer perspective a lot more complex, because all of a sudden you have 800 teams and you've got information stored in all of them. There's no central place, no central file share with a folder where all the same type of document is being stored, and corralling all of those different types of information back into some kind of workflow for long-term retention, for classification of information, is a lot more challenging than it was in some instances.
Absolutely.
Yeah, multiple systems, multiple silos across organizations. We're going to talk about an interesting use case at a large international bank in a minute. It's going to illustrate just exactly what you said, Brian.
So on the next slide, yeah, thank you. So just taking that point further then, what we're looking at and what we recommend in terms of addressing some of these challenges effectively is not trying to do things differently, but actually finding a way to work together. I think if it says it, preservation requires an active archive. If you can make sure that that's embedded into 365, into the applications where the information is being created and works in complement with what it is you're doing already to try and manage that information, that's the way to take things forward. So leverage your investment in your information governance program. Use the in-place records management that Microsoft is providing, and then start to think about how you can in effect start to embed in-place digital preservation. So don't look to create new rules, as it were. Don't look for new tools. Look to extend what you've got already in place and use automation. And Ryan, you referred to some of that a moment ago, especially tackling some of the challenges of scale. Microsoft allows you to use some great hooks. If you think about some of the automation from a classification perspective, if you've got the right licenses in place, you can automatically apply labels in many different ways now to content based on queries, search strings. I know that there are more advanced trainable classifiers. There's lots of ways of doing this, identifying your content that can help your records managers, your archivists, anyone that's involved in that lifecycle process to identify content, where and when it's being created, and managing it from the correct point. And as we're seeing those significant growth in records and electronic records in particular, that's potentially going to be significantly beneficial to organizations going forward to maintain compliance. But at the same time, if you've got an embedded preservation system in there, that can work off that classification. It can identify if you've got records where a retention schedule is long enough to support the need for a preservation action. So if you've got something with maybe 10, 20, 40, permanent, whatever happens to be retention on there, then that's the type of information that is exactly the content that should be identified for preservation actions, for management by a preservation solution. The hooks are already there. The automation for classification is in place. If you can find the right solution that's then able to use those hooks and labels correctly, it means that you can simplify all of the challenges we've been discussing at scale across those different solutions. And so, carry on.
I was going to say, I couldn't agree more. We're working with a handful of clients now that spring to mind, where the records department and the compliance managers have set up a fantastic system for record keeping inside of a siloed records management system. But it's not tightly integrated with the SharePoint environment, with the clouds environments. And as a result of that, compliance with the filing process, and in many instances, the visibility of that team into the collaboration space is so limited that it really hamstrings their ability to do good record keeping. And so I couldn't agree more that it's so important for these systems to be tightly integrated, and for there to be visibility across the boundaries.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And we did talk a little bit about how those different teams work together, and we talked about challenges between archives and records functions and issues around transfer. So we can address some of that, and as long as everyone is working collaboratively, because there is the human elements involved, but as long as you can simplify the processes and the interworking, then it means that the human element can also be simplified to go with it. And then that can address a lot of the other more human and cultural related challenges that might be around things like custody and ownership that you get around transfer as well. So people can feel more comfortable with each other. It becomes more transparent, and a lot of the barriers can then start to melt away.
Yeah, transfer of ownership has always been a challenge organizationally. So
yes,
I think you're barking up the right tree.
Okay, next slide. And I think Paul, there's a good chance for you to go into that case study you mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the poster child of unintended benefit. So HSBC is the world's local bank, right? It's a huge financial services company that really prides itself on being a local bank. And in order to do that, you need to have a sophisticated risk assessment based model to protect corporate assets. And you also have to be able to tell the story of how you are interwoven within the communities that you serve. So Tina Staples, who's head of global archives, and by the way, I encourage anyone who is interested in a tremendously well-developed corporate archive to go to HSBC and take a look. It's one of the best probably in the world. She's done an amazing job. But they've really, in terms of unintended benefits, they've really gotten a couple of things out of it. Any large organization is also siloed, as Ryan said earlier, right? He makes his living by helping people sort of contemplate and rationalize their environments and making them simpler, more effective, and lowering risk and all that good stuff. So one of the challenges of being a large financial services institution is you get sued all the time. So you have to produce authentic documents that prove you were doing what you said you were doing. So that's the risk and the compliance part of this. The second part is, and there's an example in the last couple of years of a large restaurant company that was prohibited from using its trademark because it could not prove that it had used its trademark consistently across all mediums during a period of time. If they had had a digital preservation system like Tina Staples has, they could have proven that to the court and they would still be entitled to that trademark ownership. So one of the things that Tina is very concerned with is all of the intellectual property created by the trademarks of HSBC. The brand intellectual property, being able to defend it as the property of HSBC. And you need to be able to very quickly and very accurately locate content and records to support that effort. So the third is, as I said earlier, HSBC is deeply involved in the communities it served. In fact, it was one of the financial services organizations that helped after World War II in the rebuilding of the communities that it served. So they have a tremendously rich 150-year history of serving their communities, and they want to be able to use that in marketing efforts. Let's face it, checking account's checking account's checking account. But when you do business with an organization that cares to its very bones the way that HSBC does about the communities that it serves, that's what makes a difference between one financial service product and another. So that's a demonstration of risk, compliance, brand defense, and cultural marketing that are all served by digital preservation. And it's really, I encourage you to go to the corporate archive at HSBC. It's really a sight to behold. Tremendous resource. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Paul. So actually, we've covered some of these points already, but there are a couple of other items just to mention that's quite important. Now, on the previous discussion, we were talking about how you automate some of the challenges around identification, also tying into the in-place records management, the hooks and all of that. But obviously, the core of where we started today was around preservation. So we talked about automating classification, identification, transfers. You've got to automate the preservation part itself, because that's another complex challenge that we talked about just a few slides back there. And ultimately, that's going to be critical. And this is where you can put in place your preservation policy alongside your records policies as well. But that's quite an interesting one, because as well as tackling some of the things like obsolescence, file format challenges, lack of licenses, there's other rules you can put in place if you want to do so. If you're thinking about creating representations, not just for preservation purposes, but for access purposes, you can set your rules up so that you standardize on certain formats. So you can minimize file format proliferation, as it were, which I sometimes see looked at. And that can sometimes be a bigger challenge if you, as Paul mentioned earlier, the thousands of file formats that we know our customers manage, that becomes difficult to support long term. So can you, as a preservation step, actually look to create migrations to different representations where appropriate, at least for access purposes. And also, there are other organizations out there who specify rules and recommendations. So in the US, you've got the National Archives, you've got the Library of Congress, and there are other bodies which make recommendations. So as well as preservation organizations like ourselves, potentially you might want to use their rule set. And it makes sense, if you're going to try and automate a lot of this, to build in automation once you've selected your policies, to make sure that they're continually maintained in line with your chosen policy set over time. And if you're going to do that, of course, the purpose is so that information continues to be usable and readable. And there's no point being in there if no one can find it. So the other important aspect, going back to the environments we're looking to work in, embedding a preservation system, is often really critical to make sure that you can support access. And access can be applied in different ways, but one of the most interesting ones is making it so that no one has to go and find a different tool to find the information. If it's been moved out, then it's going to be a lot easier if those information workers can stay in the places they're used to. So if they have a search or a discovery requirement, and as we said earlier, if Microsoft's the ubiquitous platform in place, information may have been transferred, if it's very long-term or permanent, into a preservation repository. Ideally, you don't have to go hunting elsewhere for it if you have the right permissions and you are authorized to do so. So why not make it easy for those users to stay within their tools that they're used to, using the capabilities that they require, and find or discover that information in the tools that they're wanting to use, whether that's a compliance-centered discovery search or a SharePoint search, or whatever it happens to be as well. Okay, next slide, please. So I think we're coming towards the end, but just taking this a step a little bit further. Again, we were focusing quite a lot on information that may be starting its life within a 365 environment, but we also said earlier, of course, that during digital transformation, there's a lot of legacy systems out there, a lot of information that's in those legacy systems. And it's important to make sure that that information is protected and preserved for the long term, that it's still managed. And as we said, I've seen that myself, how many different locations from file shares, network drives consistently, that's still considered to be the place to keep information, but that presents a whole series of other challenges if not being effectively managed. If you are going to try and provide company-wide or organization or agency-wide information governance through 365, then why not try to simplify and continue to do that for all of your content? So potentially look for solutions where content, it may not need to go directly into a 365 environment if it's no longer active, obviously if it's rot, you might want to dispose of it. But if it's inactive but still needs to be managed because it has a long-term retention on it, then it is appropriate to go into a preservation solution. But if you do so, well, make sure you can still find it. Make sure it's protected effectively. And if the place where most of your workers are is in a 365 environment, then make it surfaceable there. And that, again, simplifies a lot of those challenges that we've been discussing earlier, reduces your cost of maintenance, but also reduces things like cost of training, support, time. It brings much greater efficiency. You're having a smaller tool set, and it's much more operationally efficient for all of your users as well.
A good use case that occurs to me is the one of migration as well. We often deal with customers who are looking to migrate to a modern collaboration platform like Microsoft 365, but they've got legacy information that spans 20 years and is petabytes in size and contains information that's grown organically and is not necessarily categorized. And in those instances, we usually get to a point where we can broadly paint the types of information in such a way that we can start to reason about what is actually going into this new collaboration system where, you know, storage is at a premium, and you don't want to just dump everything and try to figure it out. And the question then becomes, what do you do with what's left over? And it seems to me that this is a really good use case for securely and safely storing information in a retrievable format, where you don't just throw it over the wall into Microsoft 365 and hope to sort it out on the day.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a much more efficient, effective way of once you've classified your information, of managing that effectively for the long term there. Okay, next slide.
Great, thanks, Gareth. So just so there's no misunderstanding, digital preservation in a trusted digital repository is intended for information that is kept 10 years or longer. And certainly if you look at the DHSC, the Department of Health and Social Care in the UK, it's a perfect example, right? For years and years, the organization communicated internally using Lotus Notes, Lotus email. It's been decommissioned, no longer supported. This is one of those unintended benefits use cases. This is one that makes justifying a budget expenditure for digital preservation in a trusted digital repository a no-brainer. You can take this to IT, you can take this to finance and say, look, we're gonna make the system go away. We're gonna keep the vital information in the system. We're going to make the cost of support for that system go away. Those servers go away. The IT complexity goes away. Oh, and by the way, we inherit regulatory control because now that information is findable, usable, and it's all in one place. It can be shared across the organization. So perfect use case. Highly sensitive. These are communications between physicians, patients, physicians. The information has to be in a trusted environment, right? So digital preservation achieves that. And it ensures access to otherwise unusable records well into the future. So this is a tremendous use case that people in the audience can use for justifying budget expenditures, for generating a project, and for executing a project. And if you're starting at the very beginning, for just defining the scope of the project. You have systems that have information in them across your organization that you need to keep, that can be decommissioned, that are no longer used. This is the perfect way to do that. And this is a great use case. So next slide.
Thanks, Paul. So just the last couple, which I'll try and get through quickly to make sure we've got a few minutes at the end there. So I think these last two slides are just wrapping up. We've obviously talked about a lot of these challenges today, how they can be solved. From a Preservica perspective, we are now looking to try and find solutions to help provide the types of technical capabilities that we've just been discussing. We've been working with some of our customers, delivering proof of concepts, and so seeing how we can address some of these challenges. And the good news is actually so far we've had some really positive responses, which are tackling many of the points we've raised here today. And you can see some of the feedback here, in particular at the top there, about making improvements in addressing issues around transfer, Also talking about operational efficiency, avoiding things like downloads when it comes to finding other systems for access perspective. And just as it says there, the general volume of information that needs to be managed. So we've had some really good feedback. And just on the last slide, which I'll get through fairly quickly, once that comes up, on the next slide, please. Yep, thank you. This is actually really pleased to get some great feedback from Tanya Marshall at Vermont State. So she and her team spent some time working with one of our proof of concepts just towards the end of last year. Again, if you look at the priorities that Tanya has highlighted in terms of automating around transfers, providing preservation in place, metadata, we haven't talked a lot about metadata, but of course metadata is critical and a critical part of the records and the preservation process as well. All of that's tied in together, and these are areas that we are looking to help provide solutions for. And the really good news that we're pleased about is that the pilot work that's been done so far, as remarked there, does suggest we're on the right track in terms of solving those strategic goals. And so we're really pleased to make sure that's going forward. And just on the final word that Tanya said, that through their experience, Vermont's optimistic that what it is we're doing will help get closer to meeting some or all of those overarching digital preservation goals and those challenges that we've been discussing today. So I think that's the last one. I think there's a wrap-up slide. Any other comments, Paul or Ryan?
Yeah, the interesting thing about Tanya's use case is she is not only the state archivist, but she's also the chief records officer. So an example of where archives and records have come together.
Absolutely.
They have multiple state agencies who ultimately are going to be brought into the system so that they can automatically accession deemed permanent records from their agency to the state archive and records officers. So that you went back earlier to what you were saying is, the human trust of transferring information, losing control of information is mitigated when you have a system like this in place because it remains accessible to everybody. So you're not really giving up your ownership, you're simply transferring the information from point A to point B, if you will.
No, I'm not sure how easy it is to get that link in or whether we can provide this afterwards, but there is an opportunity. So as I said, we are looking, we are actively developing solutions here to help you, organizations, agencies like yourself, to try and address some of these challenges, to provide feedback. We're really keen to get you involved. If you are interested, then there's opportunities to, as it says there, to reserve your seat and join our pre-launch group. So a lot of what we do is making sure that we take the information from the people who are facing those challenges on a day-to-day basis. So if you are interested, then please get in touch, and I can see whether there is a way of adding that into the chat, or perhaps it can be provided after today if that's easy enough to do.
It will also come out in the email.
Brilliant. Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Well, thank you, friends, for teaching us a bit about preservation. I'm glad to see that it doesn't involve curing your records or pickling them. So good news there. What we have done for anyone who's made it this far into the webinar is we've put together a small survey which you can complete online, which will help you identify burning issues and low-hanging fruit within your own information ecosystem. So if you're interested in taking that free survey in order to see where you stand in the maturity scale, please contact Maggie at that address listed there, and she'll be happy to send you a link which you can use to complete the survey. And then over to you, Maggie.
All right, so that's all we have for y'all today. Thank you so much for coming. There will be an email coming out around this time tomorrow with the link to the recording, so keep an eye out for that. If you have any questions that come up, please feel free to email me, and I will pass your question along to our experts and get back to you. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks so much, guys, for presenting.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Have a great rest of the day.
Have a good day.